Pastor William Thompson's eulogy for rancher James Whitehorse came to an abrupt halt when the earth-shaking bellow echoed across the Whitehorse Ranch, his Bible trembling in weathered hands as 400 mourners turned toward the sound that seemed to rise from hell itself. The massive Brahman bull's black and reddish-brown form thundered across the pasture with 1,500 pounds of desperate fury, charging directly toward the flag-draped coffin beneath the ancient oak where James had proposed 38 years ago. It wasn't grief, it was something far more terrifying. Folding chairs scattered like tumbleweeds as Thunder's hooves pounded the sun-baked Texas earth, his wild eyes fixed not on the coffin, but beyond it, toward something only he could see. Margaret Whitehorse, 72 and suddenly alone in the world, pressed her arthritic hands to her chest as her late husband's beloved bull displayed behavior she'd never witnessed in 6 years of gentle partnership. "Sweet Lord in heaven," whispered Doc Reynolds, his Bible hitting the ground with a hollow thud. Thunder's charge stopped precisely where it always did, 6 feet from destruction, close enough to communicate desperation but controlled enough to avoid catastrophe. His massive frame trembled with barely contained urgency as foam flecked his muzzle, and his dark eyes seemed to plead with the humans who couldn't understand his language. What was Thunder trying to tell them before it was too late? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Whitehorse Ranch had been carved from 3,000 acres of East Texas prairie by James Mitchell's grandfather in 1923, when cattle ranching meant survival rather than sentiment, and every animal earned its keep or found its way to market. But under James's stewardship over the past 30 years, the operation had evolved into something more personal, more connected to the rhythms of the land and the needs of the creatures that called it home. Margaret Whitehorse stood beside her husband's flag-draped coffin with the hollow awareness that comes to women who've spent their lives building something beautiful only to watch it crumble in a single moment of violence. At 67, she carried herself with the posture of someone who'd learned that dignity was a choice rather than a birthright, her silver-white hair pulled back in the elegant bun she'd worn to every important occasion for the past 4 decades. The outdoor funeral service beneath the ancient oak tree had been James's specific request, written in the will that Margaret had discovered along with so many other surprises in the weeks following his death. "I want to be buried where I proposed to you," he'd written in his careful handwriting, "under the tree where Thunder likes to take his afternoon naps, where the land can see me home one last time." Thunder had been James's most successful rescue case and his most challenging puzzle. The massive Brahman bull, now 6 years old and weighing nearly 1,500 pounds, possessed intelligence that bordered on supernatural and loyalty that had never wavered since the day James found him chained and dying at an abandoned ranch. His black coat, with distinctive reddish-brown markings, made him instantly recognizable across 3 counties. But it was his uncanny ability to understand human emotions and anticipate danger that had made him legendary among local ranchers. Sarah Crowfeather had been treating Thunder since his rescue, watching him grow from a traumatized calf into a magnificent bull whose intelligence challenged everything she'd learned about bovine behavior in veterinary school. At 35, she'd built her practice around the understanding that animals possessed emotional depths and cognitive abilities that traditional medicine barely recognized. But Thunder's capabilities exceeded even her expanded expectations. The funeral gathering of 400 people represented the entire community of Millfield, Texas, plus relatives and friends who'd driven from across the Southwest to honor a man whose reputation for fairness and kindness had spread far beyond his own ranch boundaries. Neighboring ranchers, local business owners, church members, and law enforcement officers sat in folding chairs arranged in neat rows beneath the white tent that provided shade from the relentless Texas sun. Detective Maria Santos had attended not as an investigator but as a friend, though her 20 years in law enforcement had taught her to notice details that others missed. At 52, she'd seen enough sudden deaths to recognize when circumstances didn't quite align with official explanations, and something about James Whitehorse's fatal heart attack while working alone in his barn had been nagging at her professional instincts since the coroner's report was filed. The controversy erupted like a match thrown into gasoline when Thunder's bellowing shattered the sacred silence for the third time in 10 minutes. Mayor Patricia Cross stood up from her folding chair with the righteous indignation of someone whose political career depended on maintaining Millfield's reputation as a civilized farming community. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she declared, her voice carrying across the funeral gathering with the authority of 15 years in office. "We cannot allow livestock to disrupt a memorial service. Animal control needs to remove that bull immediately." But Dr. Sarah Crowfeather shook her head with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 28 years treating ranch animals across East Texas. "Ma'am, with all due respect, Thunder's exhibiting problem-solving behavior that's highly unusual for cattle. Brahman bulls are intelligent, but this level of purposeful communication suggests he's trying to convey critical information." Her words carried weight in Millfield. Sarah Crowfeather was known throughout 3 counties for her uncanny ability to diagnose problems that other veterinarians missed. The argument that followed split the funeral gathering down generational lines like a fault line splitting the earth. Younger ranchers who'd grown up hearing stories about Thunder's legendary intelligence began murmuring support for Dr. Crowfeather's position. Older church members, steeped in funeral traditions that stretched back to their grandparents' time, demanded the bull be removed before he turned the solemn ceremony into a 3-ring circus. "This is sacrilege, pure and simple," declared Ethel Morrison, the self-appointed guardian of community standards whose family had been founding members of Millfield's first church. "Poor James deserves better than this chaos. We have protocols, traditions that honor the deceased with dignity and respect." Her voice cracked with genuine emotion as she gestured toward the flag-draped coffin. "That man served this community for 40 years. The least we can do is bury him in peace." But young rancher Jake Patterson stepped forward, his boots crushing the dried grass beneath the funeral tent as he faced down the older generation with the stubborn determination of someone who owed his life to both James and Thunder. "Ma'am, with respect, poor James trusted that bull's instincts over human judgment more times than any of us can count. If Thunder's acting like this, then something's wrong. Dead wrong." Thunder seemed to sense the division his behavior was creating among the humans he'd grown to understand over 6 years of partnership with James. The massive bull stopped his charging pattern and stood perfectly still, his enormous head turning slowly to survey the arguing crowd. His dark eyes held an intelligence that made several mourners take involuntary steps backward, not from fear, but from the unsettling recognition that they were being evaluated by a mind far more complex than they'd ever imagined. Margaret Whitehorse felt the weight of 400 pairs of eyes settling on her shoulders as the argument reached a crescendo. At 72, she'd buried her parents, her siblings, and now her husband, but she'd never faced a decision that felt as momentous as this one. Honor the funeral traditions that her late husband had respected, or trust the instincts of an animal that James had loved like a son. "James always said," Margaret began, her voice barely audible above the murmured arguments, then stopped, gathering her courage. "James always said that Thunder was the smartest creature on this ranch, human or otherwise." Her words carried across the crowd with the quiet authority of a woman who'd spent 38 years married to a man known throughout East Texas for his wisdom about animals and land. "If Thunder's trying to tell us something, then we owe it to James's memory to listen." The decision hung in the air like smoke from a distant wildfire. Pastor Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his theological training warring with the unprecedented situation unfolding beneath his outdoor altar. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I understand your grief, but surely we can't base funeral proceedings on animal behavior, however unusual." Thunder made the choice for everyone. The massive bull wheeled around with surprising grace for his size and began moving toward the main barn with purposeful strides, stopping every few steps to look back at the gathering. His pattern was unmistakable. He wanted them to follow. "Doctor." Crowfeather watched Thunder's movements with the trained eye of someone who'd spent her career interpreting animal communication. "He's not just agitated," she announced to the crowd. "This is deliberate guidance behavior. Thunder's trying to lead us somewhere specific." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach as she watched Thunder's determined progress toward the barn where James had spent his final morning. "What if James was hiding something in there?" she whispered, the terrible possibility forming in her mind like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Something that needed immediate attention? The funeral procession ground to a halt as Thunder's desperation reached a fever pitch, his massive frame silhouetted against the weathered barn where secrets waited in the shadows. The discovery inside the White Horse barn redefined everything the mourners thought they knew about James's final days and Thunder's desperate behavior. Hidden in the back stall, wrapped in James's old work jacket and surrounded by empty milk bottles, heating lamps, and medical supplies, lay a Holstein calf barely 3 days old. Her black and white markings were distinctive, almost unnaturally perfect, and her breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible. "Sweet Lord Almighty," Dr. Crowfeather breathed, her experienced hands immediately moving to check vital signs. "This little one's been hand-fed around the clock. Someone's been caring for her with intensive medical attention." The evidence scattered around the makeshift nursery told a story that made Margaret's knees go weak. Empty bottles marked with precise feeding schedules in James's handwriting, temperature logs recorded every 2 hours, and heating equipment that must have been running continuously since the calf's birth. Detective Maria Santos arrived at the barn just as Dr. Crowfeather was examining the calf's condition. The veteran investigator had been called to the ranch when word spread about the disrupted funeral, but what she found changed her understanding of the case completely. "Mrs. Whitehorse," she said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years in law enforcement, "I need to ask you something directly. Did your husband mention finding any abandoned livestock in the past week?" Margaret shook her head slowly, though uncertainty clouded her weathered features. "James didn't tell me everything about ranch business. Said he didn't want to worry me with every stray animal that needed help." Her voice carried the pain of a woman realizing she'd known less about her husband's final days than she'd believed, but he'd been spending unusual amounts of time in this barn. Said he was organizing supplies for the drought season. Thunder had followed the group to the barn and now stood at the entrance, his massive frame blocking most of the afternoon sunlight. His earlier agitation had transformed into something more focused, more protective. The bull's dark eyes moved constantly between the dying calf and the humans gathered around her, as if he were monitoring their progress and finding it inadequate. Dr. Crowfeather's examination revealed the calf's critical condition. She's severely dehydrated, hypothermic despite the heating lamps, and showing signs of failure to thrive. Based on her size and development, I'd estimate she's premature by at least 2 weeks. Without intensive veterinary intervention, she has maybe 6 hours before organ failure sets in. The pronouncement hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow, the weight of impending loss adding another layer of tragedy to an already devastating day. "But here's what I don't understand," the veterinarian continued, her professional confusion evident in her furrowed brow. "The level of care she's received is extraordinary. Whoever was feeding her knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't amateur animal husbandry. This is the work of someone with serious veterinary knowledge." Detective Santos was already working her cell phone, calling for additional units in the crime scene investigation team. Something about the timeline wasn't adding up, and her instincts told her that James Whitehorse's death might not be the straightforward heart attack everyone had assumed. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I need you to think carefully. Did James have any enemies?" "Anyone who might have had issues with his ranching practices or business dealings?" Margaret's face went pale as the detective's implications sank in. "You think someone hurt James?" The possibility had never occurred to her. James was beloved throughout the community, known for his generosity and fair dealing with neighbors, suppliers, and employees. But as she thought back over the past week, disturbing details began surfacing in her memory. He'd been getting phone calls late at night, she admitted reluctantly. Calls that made him angry, which wasn't like James at all. He was usually the calmest man you'd ever meet. But these calls, they'd have him pacing the kitchen afterward, muttering about people who prey on the helpless. Her voice grew stronger as the memories crystallized, and he'd been carrying his old service revolver again. Said it was just precaution during drought season when desperate people sometimes tried to steal cattle. Thunder's behavior suddenly made terrible sense. The bull's charging pattern at the funeral hadn't been random grief, it had been desperate communication. He'd been trying to lead them to this dying calf, this evidence of James's final act of mercy that someone clearly hadn't wanted discovered. The massive animal's loyalty extended beyond death, his protective instincts driving him to complete the mission that James could no longer finish. Young Jake Patterson, who'd been silent since entering the barn, suddenly spoke up with the observation that changed everything. "Mr. Whitehorse asked me about cattle rustling operations last week. Said he'd heard rumors about someone targeting specific bloodlines, stealing valuable breeding stock." His words hung in the barn's stifling air like a thundercloud ready to burst. "He wanted to know if I'd seen any strangers scouting our herds." Dr. Crowfeather's face went ashen as Jake's revelation triggered a memory she'd been trying to suppress. "There's something I need to tell you all," she said quietly, her professional composure cracking under the weight of guilt and fear. "Something I should have reported weeks ago." The confession that followed would shatter the community's understanding of the gentle veterinarian they'd trusted for nearly 3 decades. "My brother Tommy has been asking questions about James's cattle for months. Specific questions about breeding records, bloodlines, and market values. I thought he was just curious about the ranching business. But now—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Family loyalty had blinded her to signs that might have saved James's life. Thunder's protective stance at the barn entrance took on new meaning as the pieces of a darker puzzle began falling into place. The bull hadn't just been trying to lead them to a dying calf. He'd been trying to expose a crime that had cost his beloved human partner his life. The truth about James Whitehorse's final 3 days unfolded like a nightmare that had been hiding in plain sight. Detective Santos's investigation revealed a timeline that transformed the community's understanding of both the man they'd buried and the forces that had destroyed him. 3 days before his death, James had discovered something that would cost him his life and save another. Security footage from the neighboring Harrison Ranch showed a chilling sequence of events that began at 3:17 a.m. on Tuesday morning. A dark pickup truck had pulled up to the stock pond on the abandoned Johnson property, and 2 figures had dragged something heavy from the truck bed. When the footage was enhanced, the objects became horrifyingly clear: a dead Holstein cow and her newborn calf dumped like garbage beside the murky water. The mother had been shot through the head at close range, Detective Santos explained to the gathered crowd outside the barn, her voice tight with professional anger. Execution style. Someone wanted to make sure she was dead before dumping her body. The baby calf, barely hours old, had been left to die of exposure and starvation. It was a level of cruelty that shocked even veteran law enforcement officers who'd seen their share of animal abuse cases. James had discovered the scene during his routine morning check of the ranch boundaries. His daily journal, found hidden beneath loose floorboards in the barn, revealed the agonizing decision he'd faced. "Found them at dawn," he'd written in his careful handwriting. "Mother's been dead for hours, but the baby's still breathing. Can't call authorities, she's too weak for transport. They'll put her down for her own good. Can't let that happen." Not on my watch. Margaret listened to her husband's final written words with a mixture of pride and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm her 72-year-old heart. "That was James," she whispered to no one in particular. "Never could walk away from something that needed help, even when helping meant putting himself at risk." Her arthritic hands shook as she touched the journal pages that contained her husband's thoughts during his last days alive. The journal entries revealed James's growing suspicion that the dumping wasn't random. "Third case this month," he'd written. "Always prime breeding stock. Always shot execution style. Someone's targeting specific bloodlines." His investigation had led him to surveillance footage from multiple ranches, security camera recordings that painted a picture of systematic cattle theft and murder spanning 3 counties. Dr. Crow. Feather's face grew increasingly pale as Detective Santos read aloud from James's notes. The veterinarian's hands trembled as she recognized names and locations that her brother Tommy had mentioned during their few awkward family conversations over the past year. "He said he was doing consulting work for ranchers," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I thought he meant legitimate business. I never imagined." The investigation took a darker turn when deputies searching the Johnson property discovered a shallow grave containing the remains of the Holstein cow from the security footage. But forensic examination revealed details that elevated the case from animal cruelty to something far more sinister. "She wasn't just shot," Detective Santos reported grimly. "She was systematically harvested, organs removed, blood drained. This was professional butchering disguised as disposal." Thunder's agitation had been building throughout the investigation, his massive frame pacing restlessly around the barn's perimeter. The bull's behavior wasn't random. He was displaying the protective circling pattern that ranchers recognized as a sign of imminent threat. His dark eyes constantly scanned the horizon, his ears pricked forward in the alert posture that James had learned to trust implicitly during their 6 years together. Margaret's world crumbled further when Detective Santos revealed the financial motive behind the cattle murders. "We've traced a black market operation selling premium beef to high-end restaurants in Dallas and Houston. The profit margins are enormous. A single prime cow can be worth $50,000 when sold through illegal channels." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. James hadn't just died trying to save a calf, he'd died uncovering a criminal enterprise worth millions of dollars. "Your husband stumbled onto something bigger than animal cruelty," Detective Santos continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "This is organized crime, Mrs. Whitehorse. The kind of operation that kills to protect itself." The weight of understanding settled over Margaret like a burial shroud. Her husband hadn't died of natural causes during a rescue mission. He'd been murdered by criminals who saw him as a threat to their lucrative business. Dr. Crowfeather's confession came in broken sentences, punctuated by tears of guilt and shame. "Tommy's been asking me about cattle diseases, about how to keep livestock healthy during transport. I thought he was trying to start a legitimate ranching operation. I even gave him medical supplies, antibiotics, feeding equipment." Her voice cracked with the realization of how her innocent assistance had enabled her brother's crimes. "God help me, I gave him everything he needed to keep stolen cattle alive long enough to process them for sale. I was helping him murder families' livelihoods without even knowing it." The veterinarian's anguish was palpable as she faced the community she'd served faithfully for nearly 3 decades, knowing that her family connection to the killer would forever change how they saw her. Thunder's protective instincts reached a crescendo when Jake Patterson spotted movement along the ranch's main access road. A dark pickup truck was approaching slowly, its windows tinted too dark to see the driver clearly. The massive bull's response was immediate and terrifying. He positioned himself between the barn containing the dying calf and the approaching vehicle, his 1,500-pound frame radiating menace that could be felt from 50 yards away. "That's Tommy's truck," Dr. Crowfeather whispered, her face going white as bone. "He's coming back." The realization hit everyone simultaneously. The killer was returning to the scene, probably to eliminate any evidence that James might have left behind. Thunder's desperate behavior at the funeral suddenly made perfect sense. The bull had been trying to warn them that danger was approaching, that his beloved human's final mission was incomplete and under threat. Detective Santos was already on her radio calling for backup units and roadblocks, but the nearest sheriff's deputies were 20 minutes away. The funeral gathering found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. 400 mourners, including elderly people and children, facing a killer who'd already proven his willingness to murder anyone who threatened his operation. Thunder made the choice that would define the next crucial minutes. The massive bull began moving toward the approaching truck with the steady, purposeful gait of a creature who understood that everything he loved was under threat. His hooves struck the hard-packed earth with rhythmic precision, each step building momentum toward a confrontation that would determine whether James's sacrifice had meaning or would be erased by the same evil that had killed him. Margaret watched Thunder's advance with a mixture of terror and pride that threatened to stop her heart. At 72, she'd thought she understood courage, but watching an animal choose to face mortal danger to protect an orphaned calf revealed depths of bravery that humbled her human understanding. "That bull's about to do what James would have done," she whispered to Dr. Crowfeather. "He's going to stand between evil and innocence, no matter the cost." The truck stopped exactly where the ranch road met the main pasture, and Tommy Stone stepped out with the casual confidence of someone who believed he controlled the situation. But his expression changed dramatically when he saw Thunder approaching with the unstoppable determination of 1,500 pounds of protective fury. The bull's advance wasn't a charge, it was a calculated approach by an animal intelligent enough to understand tactics and brave enough to face whatever consequences his actions might bring. "Well, I'll be damned," Tommy called out, his voice carrying across the pasture with false bravado that didn't quite mask the fear creeping into his tone. "Looks like old James left me one more problem to clean up." He reached into his truck and pulled out a cattle prod, the electric weapon crackling with blue sparks that spoke of painful voltage designed to control animals much larger than humans. Thunder's response revealed the true depth of his intelligence and the strength of his bond with James. Instead of charging blindly into the weapon, the bull stopped 20 feet away and began producing a sound that none of the humans had ever heard before. It wasn't a bellow or a moo, but something deeper, more complex, a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself and into the bones of everyone present. The sound carried across the ranch with the power of a war cry, and within minutes, answering calls came from cattle scattered across 3,000 acres. Bulls, cows, and steers began moving toward the main barn from every direction, drawn by Thunder's summons in a display of bovine solidarity that defied everything the ranchers thought they knew about cattle behavior. "Sweet Jesus," whispered old Bob Patterson, his 73 years of ranching experience offering no explanation for what he was witnessing. "Thunder's calling in the cavalry." The sight of nearly 200 head of cattle converging on the barn created a natural amphitheater of muscle and horn that surrounded Tommy Stone's truck with living walls of protective fury. Dr. Crow Feather watched her brother's face transform from confidence to confusion to genuine fear as he realized he was facing not just one angry bull, but an entire herd united in protection of their weakest member. "Tommy!" she called out, her voice carrying across the tension-filled space between the truck and the barn. "It doesn't have to end like this. Put down the weapon and we can talk." But Tommy's response revealed the true depth of his desperation and the twisted logic that had driven him to murder. "Talk!" he shouted back, his voice cracking with years of suppressed rage and bitterness. "Like we talked when Dad put a gun to his head because his cattle died and the bank took everything. Like we talked when Mom worked herself to death trying to save a farm that was already lost?" His words carried the pain of childhood trauma that had festered into adult cruelty, but they also revealed the fatal flaw in his criminal empire. Tommy Stone wasn't just stealing cattle for profit. He was trying to inflict on other families the same devastation that had destroyed his own childhood. The dying calf in the barn represented not just evidence of his crimes, but a symbol of the innocence he'd lost and was determined to take from others. Thunder seemed to understand that words had failed and action was required. The massive bull lowered his head in the classic charge position, his dark eyes fixed on the man who threatened everything James had died protecting. But instead of rushing forward, Thunder waited, giving the humans one last chance to resolve the situation peacefully before he took matters into his own hooves and horns. The confrontation that followed would be remembered in Millfield for generations as the moment when good and evil faced each other across a Texas pasture with the lives of innocents hanging in the balance. Tommy Stone stepped out of his truck with the calculated confidence of a man who'd spent months planning for this exact scenario, but his expression faltered when he saw the wall of cattle that had assembled in response to Thunder's call. Nearly 200 head of livestock surrounded the barn in concentric circles, their collective presence creating an intimidating barrier that no single human could hope to breach. Bulls, cows, and steers from across the 3,000-acre ranch had answered Thunder's summons, drawn by instincts older than civilization and loyalty deeper than human understanding. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a living fortress of muscle, horn, and protective fury. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," whispered old Bob Patterson, his 73 years of ranching experience offering no precedent for what he was witnessing. "Thunder's organized the whole damn herd." The massive Brahman bull stood at the center of the formation, like a general commanding his troops, his dark eyes never leaving Tommy Stone's face as the standoff intensified with each passing second. Tommy's bravado cracked when he realized the scope of what he was facing. The cattle prod in his hands, designed to control individual animals, was useless against an organized herd that showed no signs of fear or submission. "You think your precious animals can stop me?" he shouted, but his voice carried the high pitch of desperation rather than confidence. "I've been planning this for months. One dead rancher and his stupid bull won't change anything, Doc." Crowfeather stepped forward from the crowd of mourners, her 28 years of veterinary practice giving her the courage to face the brother she'd failed to recognize as a monster. "Tommy, please," she called out, her voice carrying across the tense pasture with the pain of a sister who'd spent years making excuses for inexcusable behavior. "These people never hurt you. James never hurt you. Stop this madness before it destroys what's left of our family." But Tommy's response revealed the true depth of his psychological damage and the twisted logic that had driven him to murder. "Family?" he laughed, the sound harsh and broken against the Texas heat. "You mean the family that abandoned me when Dad killed himself? The family that never once asked if I needed help putting my life back together? James Whitehorse had everything I lost: a loving wife, a successful ranch, respect from his community. Why should he get to keep what I could never have?" His words exposed the canker of jealousy and resentment that had been eating at him for decades. Tommy Stone hadn't just been stealing cattle for profit. He'd been destroying other families' happiness because his own childhood had been destroyed by tragedy and neglect. The revelation struck the gathered mourners like a physical blow. The recognition that evil could grow from pain left untended and bitterness allowed to fester. Margaret Whitehorse felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest as she listened to Tommy's confession. At 72, she'd seen enough of life to understand how childhood trauma could twist a soul beyond recognition, but she'd also seen enough love to know that pain was never an excuse for creating more pain. "You're talking about destroying innocent lives because yours was hard," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived the Great Depression, 2 wars, and countless personal losses without losing her humanity. "Honey, we've all got scars. We've all lost things that mattered. But most of us don't turn our pain into weapons against folks who never done us wrong." Her words carried the wisdom of 7 decades lived fully, the understanding that suffering was universal, but cruelty was a choice. Thunder's protective instincts reached a fever pitch when Tommy raised the cattle prod threateningly, the electric weapon crackling with blue sparks that promised pain and submission. The massive bull's response was swift and decisive. He charged forward with the controlled fury of 1,500 pounds of muscle and bone, but stopped precisely 10 feet from Tommy's position, close enough to demonstrate his power, far enough to avoid the electric weapon's reach. The confrontation triggered a chain reaction among the assembled cattle that demonstrated the complex social structures and communication systems that most humans never recognized in livestock. Each bull in the formation moved exactly 1 step closer to the threat, their synchronized movement creating a tightening circle that trapped Tommy between the truck and an increasingly aggressive wall of living protection. Detective Santos had her service weapon drawn, but couldn't risk firing into the crowd of animals and humans. The situation had evolved beyond standard law enforcement protocols into something that required delicate negotiation and split-second timing. "Stone!" she called out, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years in uniform. "You're surrounded and outnumbered. Put down the weapon, and we can discuss terms." But Tommy's mental state had deteriorated beyond rational negotiation. The stress of maintaining his criminal operation, combined with the guilt of murdering a man he'd secretly respected, had pushed him into a psychological corner from which violence seemed like the only escape. "You don't understand," he screamed, waving the cattle prod wildly. "I can't go to prison. I won't survive in there. I'd rather die fighting than rot in a cell." The dying calf in the barn chose that moment to release a weak, mournful cry that cut through the tension like a knife through butter. The sound was barely audible to human ears, but it triggered an immediate response from Thunder and the assembled herd. Every animal turned toward the barn with the coordinated precision of a military unit responding to a distress signal. Thunder's intelligence manifested in a strategy that caught everyone by surprise. Instead of attacking Tommy directly, the bull began moving in a wide circle around the gunman, his massive hooves churning up dust clouds that reduced visibility and created confusion. The other cattle followed his lead, creating a swirling wall of movement that disoriented Tommy and prevented him from maintaining clear sight lines to his targets. Margaret watched the tactical display with growing amazement and terror. "That bull's thinking 3 moves ahead," she breathed to Dr. Crowfeather. "James always said Thunder understood strategy better than most people, but this is like watching a general command his army." The veterinarian nodded grimly, her professional understanding of animal behavior telling her that they were witnessing something extraordinary and potentially deadly. The dust storm created by the circling cattle provided the cover that Detective Santos needed to advance her position. Using the chaos as concealment, she moved closer to Tommy's truck while maintaining radio contact with backup units that were still 15 minutes away. "I need that time," she muttered into her radio. "Keep this situation contained until we get proper support." Tommy's desperation reached a breaking point when he realized he was losing control of the situation. The cattle prod that had seemed like adequate protection against individual animals was useless against a coordinated herd that showed no signs of fear or retreat. "You want to play games?" he screamed, pulling a revolver from his truck's glove compartment. "Let's see how your precious bull handles bullets." The appearance of the firearm changed everything. Thunder stopped his circling pattern and faced Tommy directly, his massive head lowered in the classic charge position that every rancher in Texas recognized as a warning of imminent attack. But the bull's intelligence showed in his restraint. He waited, giving the humans one final chance to resolve the situation before he took action that would likely result in death for both predator and protector. Margaret's heart broke as she recognized the impossible choice that Thunder was prepared to make. The bull would sacrifice his own life to protect the dying calf in the barn, just as James had sacrificed his life to save her in the first place. "That's love," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Pure, selfless love that doesn't count the cost or calculate the odds. That's what James taught him. And that's what he's prepared to die for." The standoff stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point, with 400 human lives and countless animal lives hanging in the balance of Tommy Stone's deteriorating mental state and Thunder's unwavering determination to complete his beloved partner's final mission. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the scene, creating a crucible of heat and tension where seconds felt like hours, and every heartbeat echoed like thunder across the ranch that had become a battlefield between love and hatred, between protection and destruction. Dr. Crowfeather made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, stepping forward into the no-man's land between her brother and the protective wall of cattle. "Tommy," she called out, her voice breaking with 28 years of accumulated guilt and love. "I'm coming to you, but I need you to put down the gun. Please, baby brother, let me help you the way I should have helped you years ago." The use of his childhood nickname stopped Tommy in his tracks, the gun wavering in his hands as memories of a better time threatened to break through the wall of rage and resentment he'd built around his heart. For a moment, the broken man he'd become flickered with the shadow of the little boy who'd once looked up to his big sister as his only source of safety and love in a world that had shown him too much cruelty too young. Thunder sensed the shift in the emotional atmosphere and held his position, his massive frame poised between protection and attack, while his intelligent eyes assessed the rapidly changing dynamics of the confrontation. The bull's patience was infinite when it came to protecting those he loved, but his tolerance for threats had been exhausted by 3 days of grief and the knowledge that time was running out for the innocent life depending on his protection. The moment Dr. Sarah Crowfeather stepped into the killing zone between her brother and Thunder's protective stance, the fragile balance of the standoff shattered like glass hitting concrete. Tommy Stone's finger tightened on the revolver's trigger as his sister's approach triggered memories he'd spent 26 years trying to bury. Memories of the only person who'd ever shown him unconditional love before the world taught him that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Stay back, Sarah," Tommy warned, but his voice cracked with the uncertainty of a man whose carefully constructed wall of hatred was developing cracks. "You don't understand what I've had to become to survive. You had your veterinary practice, your respected place in the community. I had nothing but the wreckage of everything Dad couldn't save." Thunder's massive frame remained motionless, but his dark eyes tracked every micro-expression on Tommy's face with the calculated patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The bull's intelligence, enhanced by 6 years of partnership with James, allowed him to read human body language with uncanny accuracy. He could sense Tommy's finger pressure on the trigger, could smell the fear sweat mixing with rage adrenaline, could hear the rapid heartbeat that indicated a man on the edge of complete breakdown. Margaret Whitehorse watched the confrontation unfold with the hollow awareness that she was about to witness more death on the day she'd buried her husband. At 72, she'd seen enough tragedy to recognize the signs of inevitable violence, but she'd also learned that sometimes the most desperate situations produce the most unexpected miracles. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her arthritic hands clasped in prayer. "Don't let that boy's pain destroy what's left of this family." The dying calf in the barn chose that moment to release another weak cry, the sound barely audible, but carrying the unmistakable distress of a creature fighting for life against impossible odds. Thunder's response was immediate and heartbreaking. The massive bull turned his head toward the barn and answered with a low, rumbling call that seemed to promise protection and comfort to the orphaned baby who'd become his responsibility. Tommy's psychological dam burst at the sound of Thunder's gentle response to helpless suffering. "Stop it!" he screamed, the gun wavering wildly in his shaking hands. "Stop making it sound like you actually care. Animals don't love, they just survive." "Love is a lie people tell themselves to feel better about a world that doesn't give a damn about them." His words revealed the core wound that had shaped his entire adult life, the belief that love was an illusion shattered by the reality of loss and abandonment. Tommy had convinced himself that destroying others' capacity for love was somehow justice for his own childhood devastation. But facing Thunder's obvious devotion to James and the dying calf was forcing him to confront the possibility that he'd built his entire worldview on a lie. Dr. Crow. Feather took another step closer, her voice gentle but urgent as she tried to reach whatever humanity remained in her brother's tormented soul. "Tommy, you're wrong about love. I see it every day in my practice. Animals who refuse to leave their sick companions, mothers who'll die protecting their young, bonds that survive separation and loss. What Thunder's showing us right now, that's real love. The kind that acts without expecting anything in return." The veterinarian's words triggered a memory that Tommy had buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. He was 8 years old, sitting in the barn during a thunderstorm, terrified by the lightning and his father's increasingly violent mood swings. Sarah had found him there, wrapped him in an old horse blanket, and stayed with him until the storm passed, humming lullabies and promising that everything would be okay. She'd been only 14 herself, but she'd chosen to protect her frightened little brother instead of staying safe in her own room. "You did love me once," Tommy whispered, the gun dropping slightly as the memory overwhelmed his carefully constructed defenses. "Before everything went to hell. Before Dad started drinking himself to death and Mom stopped talking to anyone but the bill collectors. You used to tell me stories about animals, about how they took care of each other even when humans failed them." Thunder sensed the shift in Tommy's emotional state and made a decision that demonstrated the true depth of his intelligence and compassion. The massive bull slowly lowered his head and took one careful step forward, not in attack, but in something that looked remarkably like approach behavior, the way a dominant animal might test whether a threat had transformed into something that could be tolerated or even helped. Margaret watched in amazement as Thunder's body language changed from aggressive protection to cautious assessment. "That bull's reading Tommy's heart," she murmured to Detective Santos, who was positioned behind the truck with her weapon drawn but held low. "Thunder knows the difference between evil and pain." James always said animals understand emotions better than humans do because they don't complicate feelings with words and justifications. The moment of potential redemption was shattered when Tommy's radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission from his criminal partners. "Stone, you copy. We're 10 minutes out with the cleanup crew. Make sure there's nothing left to find when we arrive." The voice was cold, professional, and utterly without mercy, the sound of men who killed for profit and convenience rather than passion or desperation. Tommy's face transformed as he realized his criminal associates were approaching with orders to eliminate all witnesses, including his sister and the 400 mourners who'd stumbled into his operation. "Oh, God," he whispered, the gun shaking violently in his hands. "They're coming to kill everyone. Sarah, you have to run. You all have to run." They won't leave witnesses. The revelation that additional killers were approaching sent shockwaves through the crowd of mourners, transforming a standoff between one desperate man and a protective bull into a race against time with hundreds of innocent lives hanging in the balance. Detective Santos immediately began coordinating evacuation procedures while calling for emergency backup. But the nearest substantial law enforcement was 30 minutes away, twice as long as they had before Tommy's associates arrived. Thunder seemed to understand the escalating danger with supernatural clarity. The bull's earlier protective stance evolved into something more complex and strategic as he began positioning the assembled cattle in defensive formations around the barn and the funeral gathering. His low-frequency calls directed bulls to block access roads while cows formed protective barriers around elderly mourners who couldn't move quickly. "That animal's organizing a military defense," Detective Santos observed with professional amazement. "He's using the terrain, the herd dynamics, and strategic positioning like he understands tactical planning." The sight of nearly 200 cattle moving in coordinated patterns around the ranch defied everything anyone knew about bovine behavior and intelligence. Dr. Crowfeather made the hardest decision of her professional life when she realized that saving her brother meant accepting that he would face justice for his crimes, but allowing his criminal partners to arrive meant certain death for innocent people. "Tommy," she said firmly, her veterinarian's training giving her the courage to make life and death decisions under pressure. "Give me the gun. Help us protect these people. It's not too late to choose differently." Tommy's response revealed the last vestige of the frightened boy who'd once depended on his sister's protection. "I wanted to stop after the first few cattle," he admitted, tears streaming down his face as the weight of his crimes crashed over him. "But they said they'd kill you if I backed out. Said they knew where you lived, where you worked. I kept stealing and killing to keep you safe, and now I've brought them right to your door anyway." The tragic irony hit Dr. Crowfeather like a physical blow. Her brother had been committing murder to protect her from the very criminals he'd gotten involved with to make money for his dead father's medical bills. The cycle of violence and protection had trapped them both in a web of crime and guilt that seemed impossible to escape. Thunder's strategic thinking reached its peak when he sensed the approach of vehicles on the ranch's perimeter roads. The bull's enhanced hearing, sharpened by years of partnership with James, detected the sound of multiple engines moving in coordinated formation, the professional approach of killers who'd done this before. His response was to position himself directly between the approaching threat and the barn containing the dying calf, accepting that he would be the first casualty in whatever battle was coming. The massive bull's willingness to sacrifice himself for an orphaned calf he'd known for only 3 days embodied everything James Whitehorse had believed about the nobility possible in both animals and humans. Thunder had learned from his human partner that some things were worth dying for, and he was prepared to prove that lesson with his own blood if necessary. Margaret felt her heart breaking as she watched Thunder prepare for his final stand. At 72, she'd thought she understood courage, but seeing an animal choose certain death to protect innocence revealed depths of bravery that humbled her understanding of heroism. James," she whispered to the memory of her husband. "You taught him too well. He's going to die the same way you did, protecting something that can't protect itself." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Tommy's radio crackled again with updates that chilled everyone's blood. "ETA 5 minutes. Remember, no witnesses means no problems. Make it look like a gas explosion took out the funeral." The casual discussion of mass murder revealed the true scope of the criminal operation that James had died trying to expose. Thunder's final preparation for battle included something that no one expected. The massive bull approached the barn and began producing the same low-frequency rumbling that had helped stabilize the calf's condition earlier. But this time, his call wasn't directed at the dying baby animal. It was directed at the approaching killers, a challenge that carried across the Texas landscape with the primal authority of a creature who'd chosen his ground and was prepared to defend it to the death. The revelation that transformed everything came not from the approaching killers or Tommy's desperate confession, but from Margaret Whitehorse's trembling hands as she opened James's final letter, a document that Detective Santos discovered tucked inside the barn's feed bin while searching for additional evidence. The envelope bore Margaret's name in James's careful handwriting, along with instructions that made her blood run cold. "Open only if Thunder acts like something's wrong after I'm gone." "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, and she read aloud with a voice that cracked like autumn leaves. "If you're reading this, then my suspicions about Tommy Stone were correct, and he's managed to silence me before I could expose his operation. But I pray that Thunder's intelligence and loyalty will lead you to this letter, and to the truth that might still save innocent lives." The letter revealed James's 3-day investigation into cattle disappearances across East Texas, a systematic theft operation that had been disguised as random predator attacks or cattle diseases. "Tommy's been using Sarah's veterinary knowledge without her awareness," James had written. "He asks her technical questions about keeping livestock healthy during transport, about sedation techniques, about preventing disease spread in confined animals. She thinks she's helping him start a legitimate ranching business, but he's using her expertise to keep stolen cattle alive long enough to process them for black market sales." Dr. Crowfeather's face went ashen as the full scope of her unwitting participation became clear. For 2 years, she'd been providing her brother with detailed medical protocols, advanced feeding techniques, and transportation methods that had enabled him to steal and murder cattle worth millions of dollars. "Dear God," she whispered, her veterinary oath to do no harm, mocking her from the depths of her professional conscience. "I've been helping him all along." But the letter's most devastating revelation was yet to come. James had discovered that Tommy's operation extended far beyond simple cattle rustling into something that threatened the foundation of the community's agricultural economy. "He's been targeting specific bloodlines," Margaret continued reading, her voice growing stronger as anger replaced shock. "Bulls and cows with superior genetics, breeding stock that represents generations of careful improvement. He's not just stealing animals, he's destroying entire family legacies." Thunder's behavior during the letter reading revealed intelligence that bordered on supernatural understanding. The massive bull moved closer to Margaret as she read, his dark eyes fixed on the paper as if he could comprehend every word of his beloved James's final message. When Margaret reached the section about the dying calf in the barn, Thunder's ears pricked forward and he released a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "The calf hidden in my barn is evidence of Tommy's most heinous crime," James's letter continued. "He murdered her mother, a prize Holstein worth $80,000, not for meat, but for cruelty. He's been killing pregnant cows just to watch their babies die, destroying hope along with lives. I couldn't let this one perish the same way. If I'm dead and you're reading this, please save her." She represents every innocent life that Tommy's destroyed for no reason except his own twisted need to spread the pain he's carried since childhood. The approaching vehicles grew louder, their engines creating a mechanical symphony of threat that made the cattle herd press closer together in defensive formation. Detective Santos's radio crackled with updates from units still 10 minutes away, too far to help when the killing would begin in moments. "We're on our own," she announced grimly, checking her ammunition and realizing that 6 bullets wouldn't stop a professional cleanup crew equipped for mass murder. Tommy's mental state deteriorated further as his radio delivered increasingly urgent messages from his criminal partners. "Stone, we're at the ranch entrance. Better have this situation cleaned up because we're not leaving loose ends." The casual tone in which mass murder was discussed revealed men who'd killed so many times that human life had become meaningless arithmetic to them. "They'll kill everyone," Tommy whispered, his face pale with the realization that his attempt to protect his sister had instead led killers directly to her doorstep. "Sarah, Margaret, all these innocent people. They'll die because I was too weak to stand up to them when I should have." His confession carried the anguish of a man who'd traded his soul for survival and discovered that the price was everything he'd tried to protect. Thunder made the decision that would define the next crucial minutes of battle. The massive bull began moving away from the defensive position he'd maintained and started walking directly toward the approaching vehicles, his hooves striking the hard-packed earth with the deliberate rhythm of a war drum. His movement triggered an immediate response from the assembled herd. Nearly 200 cattle began following their leader in a formation that resembled nothing so much as a cavalry charge from the Old West. Margaret watched in amazement and terror as Thunder transformed from protector to warrior, leading the largest coordinated animal attack in Texas ranching history. "That bull's going to war," she breathed, her 72 years of life experience offering no precedent for the sight of organized bovine military action. "He's taking the fight to them instead of waiting to be slaughtered." Dr. Crowfeather realized that her brother's only chance for redemption lay in choosing sides in the battle that was about to engulf the ranch. "Tommy," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent her life healing rather than harming, "you can't undo what you've done, but you can choose what you do next. Help us save these people. Help us save that calf. Show me that the little boy I loved is still alive somewhere inside the man you've become." The sound of gunfire erupted from the ranch's main entrance as Tommy's criminal partners encountered the first wave of Thunder's bovine army. The professional killers had come prepared for human resistance, but nothing in their violent careers had prepared them for facing 200 head of cattle organized into attack formations by a bull whose intelligence exceeded most humans they'd encountered. Tommy's moment of choice arrived when his radio crackled with panicked voices reporting impossible resistance from animals that should have scattered in terror but instead were fighting with coordinated tactics. "What the hell did you do out there, Stone? These cattle are attacking like they've been trained for combat." The fear in professional killers' voices revealed the scope of Thunder's strategic genius and the effectiveness of his unconventional warfare. "I didn't do anything," Tommy replied into the radio, his voice steady for the first time in months. "But I know someone who did. James Whitehorse taught that bull everything about protecting the innocent. And now Thunder's teaching me what I should have learned years ago, that some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting seems impossible." The dying calf's weak cry from the barn provided the final motivation Tommy needed to choose redemption over self-preservation. He turned the revolver around and handed it to Detective Santos grip first, his hands shaking with the enormity of betraying the only people who'd offered him financial security since his father's suicide. "I'll help you stop them," he said quietly. "I know their equipment, their methods, their weaknesses. Maybe I can finally do something right. Thunder's charge reached the ranch entrance just as Tommy's partners realized they were facing not just resistant cattle, but an intelligent opponent who'd prepared the battlefield in advance. The massive bull had positioned his forces to funnel the killers into narrow passages where their vehicles would be vulnerable and their superior firepower neutralized by close-quarters combat with animals who had nothing left to lose. The battle for Whitehorse Ranch had begun, with Thunder leading a species war against human evil while in the barn behind them, a dying calf represented everything pure and innocent that was worth protecting. Margaret clutched James's letter to her chest and prepared to discover whether love and intelligence could triumph over greed and violence, or whether she would lose everything precious in one terrible afternoon that had started as a funeral and become a war. 6 months after the battle that transformed Millfield from a quiet farming community into a symbol of hope across rural America, the morning sun cast golden light across the Whitehorse Ranch, where an extraordinary family had taken root in soil watered by tragedy and tended by love. Margaret Whitehorse sat on her wraparound porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching Thunder teach Grace the fundamental lessons of survival and trust that would guide her through a life that had almost ended before it began. The calf that Dr. Crowfeather had once pronounced beyond saving had grown into a magnificent young Holstein with intelligence that amazed every rancher who visited the ranch. Grace followed Thunder everywhere, her black and white coat brilliant against his darker bulk as she learned to read weather patterns, identify dangerous plants, and respond to the complex communication system that Thunder had developed during his years of partnership with James. "Look at them two," Margaret murmured to herself, using the phrase that had become her morning ritual. "Just look at how that bull loves that baby." Thunder's devotion to Grace had become legendary throughout East Texas, inspiring visits from families who drove hundreds of miles to witness the bond between the massive Brahman bull and the orphaned calf he'd saved through sheer determination and love. The Whitehorse Ranch had been transformed from a working cattle operation into something more precious, a sanctuary where broken animals found healing and broken hearts discovered that family could be chosen rather than born. Margaret, at 72, had found purpose she'd never imagined possible in caring for Grace and managing the constant stream of visitors who came seeking proof that miracles still happened in a world that seemed increasingly dark. Doctor. Sarah Crowfeather arrived for her weekly visit just as Margaret was refilling her coffee cup, a routine that had become as essential to both women as breathing. The veterinarian carried the quiet dignity of someone who'd faced the worst betrayal family could offer and emerged stronger for choosing justice over blood loyalty. Her testimony had been crucial in convicting not just her brother Tommy, but the entire criminal network that had been terrorizing ranch families across 3 states. "Tommy's letter came yesterday," Sarah said quietly, settling into the rocking chair that James had built 30 years ago. The chair creaked with familiar comfort as she pulled the envelope from her jacket pocket. "He's asking permission to donate his prison wages to the ranch operating fund. Says it's the least he can do to help care for Grace." Margaret considered the request with the careful wisdom of someone who'd learned that forgiveness was a process rather than a single decision. Tommy Stone was serving 25 years in federal prison for his crimes, but his cooperation had led authorities to recover over $2 million in stolen cattle and shut down a criminal network that had operated across the Southwest for nearly a decade. "What does your heart tell you?" Margaret asked, employing the phrase that James had used whenever they faced difficult decisions about the ranch or their marriage. Sarah's answer came slowly, thoughtfully, with the careful consideration that veterinary practice had taught her to apply to complex problems without simple solutions. "My heart tells me that redemption requires action, not just remorse. If Tommy wants to contribute to Grace's care, to something positive that honors the lives he helped destroy, then maybe that's part of his healing process too. The decision reflected the community's gradual movement toward forgiveness without forgetting. Justice tempered by mercy, consequences balanced with the possibility of redemption. Thunder and Grace approached the porch as if summoned by their conversation, the massive bull moving with the careful gait he'd developed to accommodate his much smaller companion. Grace had learned to walk directly beside Thunder's front legs, positioning herself where his bulk provided maximum protection while allowing her the freedom to explore and learn. The sight of them together never failed to move Margaret to tears. At 72, she'd thought her capacity for wonder had been exhausted by decades of loss and hardship, but watching Thunder's patient instruction of Grace revealed daily miracles that kept her heart young and grateful. "James always said that love finds a way to continue," she told Sarah, her voice soft with the contentment that had replaced the raw grief of 6 months ago. He was right. Thunder's carrying on everything James believed about protecting the innocent and nurturing the helpless, and Grace is proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the darkest soil. The ranch had become something unprecedented in rural Texas, a destination where people came not just to see unusual animals, but to witness living proof that intelligence, loyalty, and love existed in forms they'd never recognized. School groups visited weekly to learn about animal behavior and the complex social structures that governed herd dynamics. University researchers studied Thunder's problem-solving abilities and communication methods, documenting behaviors that challenged traditional assumptions about bovine intelligence. But the most frequent visitors were families dealing with their own losses and tragedies, drawn by stories of how love had transcended species boundaries and death itself to create something beautiful from devastating circumstances. "They come looking for hope," Margaret often told visitors, "and they leave understanding that hope comes in all shapes and sizes, sometimes wearing fur and weighing 1,500 pounds. The financial transformation of the ranch had been as remarkable as the emotional healing. Insurance settlements from the criminal case, combined with donations from people inspired by Thunder and Grace's story, had eliminated the mortgage that had threatened Margaret's ability to maintain the property. More importantly, the steady stream of visitors had created a sustainable income that allowed her to expand the sanctuary operations and hire local staff who'd been struggling with unemployment as traditional farming became increasingly difficult. Dr. Crow Feather's practice had also evolved beyond traditional veterinary medicine into something more holistic and community-focused. Her experience with the criminal case had taught her to look for signs of abuse and neglect that went beyond medical symptoms, to understand that animal welfare was intimately connected to human welfare in ways that textbooks never addressed. "I've learned to trust animal instincts over human explanations," she told Margaret during their weekly conversations. "Thunder taught me that animals often understand situations more clearly than humans do because they're not distracted by pride, denial, or social expectations. They see truth and respond to it directly." The late afternoon ritual that had developed between Thunder and Grace had become Margaret's favorite part of each day. As the Texas sun began its descent toward the horizon, Thunder would lead Grace to the exact spot where James had proposed 38 years ago, beneath the ancient oak tree that now shaded his grave. There, the massive bull would lie down in the grass while Grace curled up against his warm flank, both animals maintaining a peaceful vigil that honored the man who'd saved them both. "That's love right there," Margaret would say to anyone who witnessed the daily ceremony. "Pure, unconditional love that doesn't ask for anything in return except the chance to keep loving." The sight had inspired hundreds of photographs, countless social media posts, and a children's book that was being published to benefit animal rescue organizations across the country. As evening settled over the White Horse Ranch, Margaret settled into her porch swing with the satisfaction of someone who discovered that life's most important chapters could be written at any age. At 72, she'd found family in the most unexpected forms, purpose in the most unlikely circumstances, and proof that her husband's legacy would continue in ways more beautiful than monuments or memorials could ever achieve. Thunder's gentle rumbling drifted across the pasture as he settled into sleep beside Grace, the sound carrying the same protective love that had saved a dying calf and transformed a grieving widow's empty house into a home filled with laughter, hope, and the daily miracles that love creates when it refuses to be conquered by loss. This story touches the deepest truth about life after 65, that our most meaningful chapters often begin when the world tells us our story should be ending. Margaret Whitehorse, at 72, discovered that family doesn't require blood relations or perfect timing. Sometimes it arrives wearing fur and weighing 1,500 pounds, teaching us that love recognizes no boundaries of age, species, or circumstance. For those of us who've buried spouses, raised children who've moved away, or wondered if our best years are behind us, Thunder and Grace prove that purpose and joy can emerge from our darkest seasons. The empty nest syndrome that haunts so many American seniors transforms into opportunity when we open our hearts to unexpected connections. Margaret's morning coffee ritual evolved from lonely habit into celebration as she watched Thunder teach Grace about trust, protection, and unconditional devotion. Their story reminds us that retirement doesn't mean retreat from meaningful life. It means freedom to discover new forms of family, new ways to matter, new reasons to wake up grateful each morning. At any age, we can choose to nurture, protect, and love creatures who need us as much as we need them. Have you found unexpected family connections with animals during your golden years? What abandoned or needy creature has brought surprising joy and purpose to your life when you thought those chapters were closed? Share your heartwarming stories in the comments below about how animals have enriched your later years.